Well, hello. I'm Troy Fullerton, and in this video, we're going to be answering the questions: what is Spanish? How did it originate? And what is it related to? We're going to be looking at the development of the Spanish language. The first question that we need to consider as we're considering what Spanish is what is a language in the first place? Language is always a part of our lives from the time we're born, and a lot of times we may take for granted the fact that the language we speak had to develop from something, had to develop somewhere, and has a history to it. There, in fact, was a time when there was no English language, and there was no Spanish language either. So we're looking at some very important history here. As we speak, English is a majorly important world language, but so is Spanish. In fact, they're practically neck and neck with each other for second and third place as far as the sheer numbers of speakers of either language, and they're spoken over broad geographical areas. So imagine a time when there was no English and a time when there was no Spanish. What was going on here? What was going on over on the other side of the world? Well, to answer that question, let's start with what a language is. A language is a code developed to get thoughts from one head into another. We're all born with a language acquisition device that we were created with that enables us to absorb the native language that we are surrounded by. Now, under normal circumstances, an individual learns his or her native language by acquisition naturally, and then any language subsequently acquired as an older individual, as an adult, or even as a teenager, is going to be filtered through that original language. An inner language will be developed, and it's very difficult for somebody learning a language later in life to acquire another language on a native level. They may acquire a near native level, but very seldom are they going to acquire another language on a native level. Now, this comes into play with the development of other languages, because often the way other languages are developed is because some language was superimposed on people who already spoke another language, and it was received imperfectly on some level. That's going to come into play here. So let's get back to our questions. What is Spanish? How did it develop? How did it originate? And what is it related to? We're going to answer some of those questions. So first of all, let's just get some statistics about the Spanish language. There are approximately 400 million people who speak Spanish worldwide. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising of a statistic when we just look at a map and we consider all of the countries: Mexico, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. Just on this side of the globe, all of these countries are Spanish-speaking countries. What may surprise an individual, however, is to learn that 30 million of the world's Spanish-speaking population lives right here in the United States. So roughly 8% of the world's Spanish-speaking population is right here in the United States. Remember that the next time you hear somebody complain when somebody is speaking Spanish that, if they're going to speak Spanish, they should just go home. Well, as a matter of fact, a lot of them were home all along. Spanish has been spoken in what is now the United States for longer than English has. Remember that it was Spanish explorers that discovered La Florida, Florida. Remember that Texas, Texas, used to be the northern part of the Mexican state of Coahuila, and so much of the western part of the United States. Why do you think they have Spanish names like Colorado and Nevada, etc.? Much of that territory at one time belonged to Spain, and Spain set up missions in order to interact and do business with the Indians. And then that territory became Mexican when Mexico gained its independence from Spain. It wasn't until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848 that territory became part of the United States. So, just how big is that? Well, the Spanish-speaking community in the United States is the 5th largest in the world. That means if you took all of the Spanish-speaking people in the United States and you put them together in one place, you would have a population larger than the majority of the Spanish-speaking countries in the world. Spanish is the 3rd most frequently used language in the world. It's approximately tied with English. English and Spanish kind of run neck and neck with which one is more frequently spoken than the other. And of course, we're looking at approximate figures here. In case you're curious, just by sheer numbers of speakers, the most commonly spoken language on earth is Mandarin Chinese. However, Spanish and English, once again, being spoken over such vast tracts of territory, come in 2nd and 3rd place. And so that's where we're at right now as far as numbers of speakers. So very important languages. English is very important, Spanish is very important, and learning these 2 languages opens the door to many, many countries. So where did it come from? Well, that might seem like a no-brainer of a question. Of course, it came from Spain. But there was a time when there was no Spanish language, even where we currently find Spain. By the way, where do we find Spain? Well, Spain is on what we call the Iberian Peninsula. That is this territory that is right above Africa and juts out from the southwest of Europe. It's separated from France by the Pyrenees Mountains, but there it is, and on that peninsula, we have 2 nations. We have Spain and we have Portugal. Now, several hundred years before Christ, something happened. Realize that far back, you didn't have the nations that we have nowadays. You had tribes of people that populated much of the earth. So in the area that we now call Germany or Austria or Liechtenstein, that part of Central and West Central Europe, Germanic tribes populated that territory. Germanic tribes that spoke a Proto-Germanic dialect. Germanic tribes. Eventually, those Germanic tribes developed into nations and their languages became modern languages, but we're talking about many years ago. We're talking about ancient times. Well, on what we now call the British Isles, we had another group of people. We had the Celts. The Celts eventually mixed with the ancient Iberians. Some of them did. They moved down and they settled on the Iberian Peninsula and mixed with the ancient people who were already there. Now, there was no Spanish language at this time. Spanish had not been developed yet. We had the Iberians, the ancient Iberians, who had a language, and then we had the Celts who mixed, and then several hundred years went by. Now, the reason I'm explaining that is because this was the language that was already being spoken on the Iberian Peninsula. Now, you remember what I said about how people who learn a language later in life will usually acquire that language, but never actually develop it to a native level because they will filter it through the lens of the language they already spoke? Well, let's take that a step further. Nowadays, people who want to learn another language usually can read and write. We have a very high literacy rate in the United States and in the Spanish-speaking countries as well. Really, over much of the world, we have a very high literacy rate now. We also have mass-produced books. We have the internet. We have telephones. We have radios. We have newspapers. We have a lot in place to help us if we decide to acquire another language. So we can make a lot more progress a lot faster than was possible back in the day when the majority of the world was illiterate and never went to school. So let's keep that in mind as we go through this. On the Iberian Peninsula, we had the ancient Iberians, and several hundred years prior to what I'm about to tell you, Celts came down and mixed with the Iberians. So whatever language they had was that ancient Iberian language that had been modified, we could say, by the Celts who lived there. Keep in mind, several hundred years before Christ. Now, the next thing that happened, and this is the most important thing that happened, the Roman Empire brought the Latin language, and 19 years before Christ, they finished their mission of taking over the Iberian Peninsula. Now, let's remember that the Roman Empire was massive, and their language was Latin. The Romans spoke Latin, but once again, the majority of the people back then could not read or write. So when the Roman armies were fighting the Punic Wars and taking over territory, they were populating those territories with other common people. So let's just talk about that for a little bit. The Roman Empire took the Latin language to much of the world, but it was already generally an imperfect version of Latin. Scholarly, formal Latin is very complex. We're not talking about scholarly, formal people, are we? The masses of people spoke what we call vulgar Latin. Now, when we say vulgar Latin, the word vulgar has a different meaning than it means today. Nowadays, when we think of vulgar, we mean obscene, profane. But when we say vulgar Latin, we simply mean the Latin that was spoken by the uneducated masses of people. So what we want to think of is uneducated Latin. In other words, not perfect Latin. And wherever they took the Latin language, it was being received, or maybe I should say it was being imposed upon, people who already spoke another language. And so when they received this imperfect Latin, they were receiving it imperfectly. So obviously, the result is going to be something different than the original, and then those people are going to have children who are going to acquire that new language naturally and pass it on to their children, and hundreds of years are going to start going by. Now let's talk about something else in place back then. There were no airplanes back then. There were no cars or trains. And many of these people, where the Latin language was taken, were separated by mountains, by just sheer distance, by waterways. They were not only a long ways from one another, but wherever Latin landed, wherever it was taken, there were already people there who spoke something else. And so it's just inevitable. There was nothing in place, nothing at all in place to keep the uneducated languages of the masses of people standardized. Of course, wealthy people, educated people, they learned standard Latin, they learned to read and write, but we're talking about what everybody else was speaking. It was inevitable that changes were going to take place, and once again, the clock is ticking, and hundreds of years are going by. So, the first thing that happened was the Celts came to the Iberian Peninsula several hundred years before Christ. But then 19 years before Christ, vulgar Latin was mixed with that Celtic Iberian language mixture that was already in what we now call Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. So who else came? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go to Central Europe. In Central Europe, the area where we now find Germany, Austria, Liechtenstein, we had Germanic tribes that lived there. Now notice the way I said that. I didn't say Germans, did I? Just like we had Native American tribes in the United States, that was the situation that existed in much of the world. You had tribes of people that lived there. They might have been related in some way. They might have had genetic ties in some way. But you would have these tribes of people who had a particular language. Well, those tribes of people developed into modern nations, and the Proto-Germanic language that we're talking about here developed and became German, Dutch, even English. Several Germanic tribes migrated to the British Isles, and they gave us the basis for Old English. So one of those Germanic tribes was the Visigoths. I'm sure you've heard of Goths before, Gothic people. The Visigoths came in bands to the Iberian Peninsula and settled there. They were there from the 4 to 500s, and they stayed until AD 711. Now, why is it that I can give you a date when they left, but I can only give you a time span from when they arrived? Well, we're going to understand that in a little bit. But right now, let's just talk about the Visigoths. When they came, they spoke Gothic, which was another Germanic language. And they were there for several hundred years. Their language was related to English, German, and Dutch, nowadays, modern day English, German, and Dutch, because it was a language of a Germanic tribe. And several hundred of those Gothic word roots entered into the developing Spanish language. So let's look at where we've been. We already had Celts came down to mix with the Iberians on the Iberian Peninsula several hundred years before Christ. But then the most important thing happened. The Roman Empire brought the Latin language, and they finished the job of taking over the Iberian Peninsula 19 years before Christ. So Latin was there to stay, but once again, we're talking about mainly an uneducated version of Latin being received by people who already spoke another language. What developed out of that continued to roll on for several hundreds of years. Then the Visigoths started coming from the 4 to 500s, speaking a different kind of language. Germanic languages were not based on Latin, but while they were there speaking their language, there was contact with the people, and we ended up with several hundred Gothic word roots entering the language, and they are now, this day, a part of modern Spanish. But then something very important occurred. The Arabic-speaking Moors invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 711, and they took over. They came up from northern Africa, which if you look at the map, northern Africa is just south of Spain. And they came up, they took over, and they brought the Arabic language with them. Now, the Arabic language is very different from Latin. The grammars are not the same. The system for developing new words is not the same. Practically nothing is the same. But they were there for a very long time. Now, just for perspective, the United States has been a nation since 1776. So we're talking about fewer than 250 years as of the time that this video is being produced. The Arabic-speaking Moors were on the Iberian Peninsula until 1492. Now, we can remember that easily if we just remember in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So we're talking about nearly 3 times the amount of time that the United States has been a nation. Even though Arabic never supplanted Latin, or I should say the version of Latin that was developing into Spanish, it was inevitable that there was going to be a large language footprint there. As a matter of fact, nearly 5,000 Arabic-based words still exist in modern Spanish. People use those words in everyday speech and don't even think about their origin, but they came originally from the language of the Moors, Arabic. Now, remember I mentioned 711? I've got a little memory aid for you here. The Visigoths were there from the 4 to 500s until 711. Now just picture, I know this sounds funny, but just as a memory aid, the Visigoths stopping it at 711 to get their big gulps full on their way back to Central Europe. Just picture that, because the Arabic-speaking Moors were invading, and so they left. So they were there for a very long time and left a very large language footprint. Then they had what was called the reconquest of Spain, when the Latin people got up and drove out the Arabs. So back to our question. What is modern Spanish? Well, modern Spanish is vulgar Latin. That's what it is. Once again, we're talking about uneducated Latin. Vulgar Latin that was influenced by three main sources. In the first place, the Celtic Iberian language that was already in place on the Iberian Peninsula. Gothic, that was spoken by the Visigoths. And Arabic, that was spoken by the Arabic-speaking Moors. Just for review, the Visigoths left several hundred word roots in modern Spanish. They were there from the 4 to 500s until 711. The Arabic-speaking Moors were there from 711 until 1492. They left around 5,000 words from Arabic in modern Spanish. We say that Spanish is a Romance language. That does not mean that it's the language of passion, love, and romance. No, what we're saying is it's based on, or it was derived from, the language of the Roman Empire, which means Latin. All of the languages that developed out of Latin are called the Romance languages. There's quite a number of them. Romance then simply means based on Latin. Think of the word Roman. That'll help you to remember that. So what are the other major Romance languages? Well, of course, Spanish is a Romance language, but what are some of the others? Well, there's quite a number of languages and dialects. We want to know the major ones. Of course, Spanish, but then there's French. The Gauls occupied the area where we now find France. When they received the Latin language, they received it differently. They already spoke a different language, and then whatever influences were there tweaked the Latin, and French developed. Also, even in Italy, where they spoke Latin, that Latin changed over time. That Latin changed and developed into Italian. Then there's Romanian. Notice the word Roman being part of the word Romanian. Romanian in Romania. Now notice, I did not say Roman. Don't get that confused. I said Romanian, which is the language of Romania. The Romanian language is the closest to the original Latin of all of the Romance languages. And then we have Portuguese. That only makes sense because Portugal is also on the Iberian Peninsula with Spain. There are several other minor dialects and languages. Some of them are quite important. Catalan, which is spoken in Catalonia, is a major Romance language. There are other Romance languages and dialects. There are Italian dialects that were based on Latin. So there are others out there. And if you learn any one Romance language, the grammar and much of the vocabulary is going to be quite similar, generally speaking, to one another. So learning one Romance language essentially sets you up to be able to learn any of the other Romance languages a lot more easily than if you were learning them simply without that background.